Start with this news out this morning about Zaporizhia now being occupied by the Russian troops. Zelensky, as we just mentioned there, says that the world should wake up. How concerned does this seizure make you, and what does this say about Putin's strategy right now?
Yeah, I don't think that those reports are entirely accurate. Of course, it's the fog of war, so there are mixed reports coming in. But it's not Zaporizhia. Zaporizhia is actually a major city, and the Russians don't have not secured that city. They're probably not going to for a long time if they do it at all. It's this city on the periphery. It's literally translates as Energy City in Nergorod. That's where the fighting occurred. That's where the attacks on this largest nuclear power station in Europe occurred, and even there, it's unclear if the site is entirely secured by the Russians or not. So it's just the fog of war. But in terms of the hazards, this is part of the misconception and frankly wishful thinking, including by some in government, that this stays limited, that the largest country in the world attacking the largest country in Europe is not going to have unforeseen consequences, whether it's in the nuclear sphere in terms of environmental disasters or human catastrophes, or even spill over into Europe proper, into Eastern Europe. That's some wishful thinking. We need to drop the assumption that this stays limited and prepare for the consequences of spillover. And how do we avoid that? How do we mitigate that? How do we avoid something rolling for such a long time that there's an incrementalism that gets Russia to be more and more aggressive, that inevitably is provocative towards U.S. interests, more provocative to U.S. interests, because obviously we're there already.
Right. So let's talk about some of those incremental steps, though, that can be taken, because if there are these conflicting reports, we're taking a look at some of the video from the nuclear power plant site. What is it that then can be done for this to not spill over? Because we've seen over the past few days, I mean, Western allies have been forcing a lot of sanctions on Russia and Russian oligarchs. Are you saying that that is not enough, that something else needs to be done?
Yes, that's right. I think we've already had some really significant tremors. I mean, tremors maybe even light. We've levied some severe sanctions, including blocking the assets of the central bank and eliminating President Putin's war chest that he's assembled over the course of a decade. But the energy trade is still occurring. And the biggest consideration there is that it's still winter, and Europe has both an economy and a population that it needs to keep going through energy. But there are ways to soften the blow. First of all, Europe is going to bear some of these shocks, and maybe their industry operates at 80% capacity, at 100% capacity, while they provide sufficient fuel for the population to stay warm through these winter months. In the meantime, the U.S. has been establishing contingency plans to help keep energy flows going into Europe.
Right.
And in doing this, then we could target the energy trade, which would really eliminate all the incoming financial assets, the incoming currency, the incoming dollars that Russia's relying on to keep its economy going. So that's something to do in the economic sphere. We also see a creeping provision of additional capabilities to Ukraine. I saw the French announced some additional significant, sophisticated anti-armor systems. I think those need to start going in, and it shouldn't be an incremental approach. It shouldn't be just-in-time logistics or just-in-time anti-tank and air defense capabilities. We should flood the zone. We did this program called Lend-Lease in World War II, where anything that the Soviet Union needed when they were fighting the Nazis, they got. Ukraine should be given access to Lend-Lease 2.0. And I think part of that program includes unmanned combat aerial vehicles, because there's an enormous mismatch between what Russian capabilities are and what the Ukrainian capabilities are. And with these UCAVs,
right,
Ukraine could start destroying these ballistic missiles that are leveling large portions of massive cities, cities with over 1 million in population. And this is not provocative. The Turks have already been doing this with their TB2s, these Bayraktar aircraft that have been pretty effective. We need to provision the Ukrainians so this ends sooner rather than later and doesn't escalate as it goes on for weeks and months.
Right. Colonel Vindman, let's talk about how this ends, because that's the big question for a lot of people. When you think about Vladimir Putin, what do you think is the end for him? Is his goal to capture Ukraine and stop there? Do you think he plans to spill over into NATO? What's your take on that?
Yeah. Well, I could tell you for one thing, it's clear to me that this does end, and it ends with Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. I mean, territorial integrity is a question, but sovereignty intact, sovereignty and independence intact, because Russia can no longer achieve its political objectives through military force. They were planning to roll in, remove the political leadership of Ukraine, put in a puppet government, and roll out. The Ukrainian population won't tolerate that. They're out in force, and that means that the Russians would have to now occupy in order to hold these cities, and that spells disaster for an occupying military that's operating deep in enemy lines. They just don't have the force. The Ukrainians have burned through a lot of the ground forces that are required for these kinds of operations.
Right, but Colonel
That's why
Vindman,
you see
but we've heard from Vladimir Putin that this is his goal to continue on and to continue on with this invasion. But we've heard from President Zelensky, like you were saying, the Ukrainians are putting up a fight. So you still believe that sovereignty is the end game here for Ukraine?
I think it's likely at this point that Ukraine maintains its sovereignty. The question is how much suffering there is, human suffering there is, and how much of Ukraine's territory is occupied by Russia. But ultimately, I think what Putin hasn't priced in, he hasn't really priced in these sanctions. Those have an effect over weeks and months, not over days. And it's only been 9 days into this conflict. He's also not priced in the really significant destabilizing effect that nearly 10,000 Russian dead soldiers is going to have on the population. Those numbers haven't started. The Russians acknowledged only 500 dead. It's orders of magnitude larger than that. So when these things start to affect the domestic calculus, and his military starts telling him, we do not, we're out. We don't have any more ground combat power to secure Kiev, to take Kharkiv. Kharkiv is vulnerable, by the way, right. Or take some of these other cities. That's when he's going to come back to the negotiating table. And frankly, I see an outcome in which he's leveled large portions of Ukraine, set back their economy, a decade or more. And then he claims a moral victory. This sounds strange, but his moral victory for the Russian population is going to be, I've denazified, demilitarized Ukraine. It's time for Russian forces to go home, even though he's not achieved his initial political objectives. That's the way this is shaping up to end right now.
Do you see the Western nations, should Western nations be focusing then on Putin's regime ending? I mean, how should that be playing into the calculations? Because you mentioned energy sanctions, and I think a lot of people are wondering, should sanctions be focused on ending conflict right now? Should sanctions be focused on punishing Putin? What's your take?
Well, it should be, I think the primary thing is to punish the transgressions, these massive transgressions, but also think about off-ramps. So basically the opportunity to de-escalate as Russia withdraws some of these sanctions. So right now, if we were to levy energy sanctions and block energy trade, that could be one of those things that gets rolled back when Russia withdraws. But they're not. The Russians are counting on the fact that there is not an appetite to levy these energy sanctions because the economies of Western Europe and Europe are going to be hit by those sanctions, at least to a certain degree, at least through several months. So that's where we should be thinking. We should be thinking strategically for ways to end this conflict and then ease back on some things, because we don't need massive. There's already going to be massive instability in Russia, but we don't need that kind of instability that precipitates civil war. That's far-fetched for now, but it could end up being that way when you have socio-economic protests, not the political protests of people opposing war with Ukraine, but the ones that are where Russians can't feed their families, or they're not receiving pay, or the law enforcement forces that have been cracking down on protests choose to not do so because they're not getting paid anymore. That's when things get really hairy, and Putin will be cornered and increasingly probably unpredictable in that kind of situation.
And, I'd love to ask you, because you've met Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky a few times. And as you mentioned, he's put up a fight, really. We've heard a lot from him in the past week or so. How do you think this ends for him?
I think he's no longer just the leader of Ukraine. He's the leader of the Western democratic world, or the democratic world, period. He's he's rallied democracies around the fundamental values that we all share, which is freedom, independence, self-determination. And early on, I was really quite concerned about the rising tide of authoritarianism and what that means for democracies that are under threat. But with the rally cry of Vladimir Zelensky and the Ukrainian people, I'm less concerned about that. I think authoritarian regimes are going to be more thoughtful of how they provoke. I think the scenarios and fears of China attacking Taiwan are significantly diminished because of how the Ukrainians performed and beating back the second most powerful military in the world. That's what it was. That's what the Russian army was considered. So that makes it really more challenging for authoritarian regimes to be provocative and attack democracies. But I think for Vladimir Zelensky, he's getting increasingly frustrated. He's under a great deal of pressure. He's not getting the kind of support he needs. His people are dying, and you could see that in his tone and his voice. I think as long as some really disastrous event doesn't occur and he doesn't get assassinated or killed by a bomb, I think he will go on to lead Ukraine into a future that is very, very different than its first 30 plus years. It's a future that's locked into a Western direction. And with the aid that's coming in, these proposals for $100 billion from the European Union, the U.S. hasn't even come up on the stated an amount. But these have the significant potential to reestablish Ukraine as a hub, a modern country, and something that adds new blood to old Europe that was comfortable where it was. And we need that kind of spirit in our Western democracies.
And Colonel Vindman, let's just end on, I mean, you seem to be pretty optimistic about the situation currently, aside from what others are saying, the worst is yet to come. Let's just talk about if Russian troops, though, continue to advance towards Kyiv and potentially the capital falls and Ukraine is taken over by the Russians. What does that look like? I mean, is that a possibility that the West needs to be considering at this point in time?
It should, of course, be something that the West should be considering. The fact is that I'm looking past the next several weeks and even several months to how this ends. I think the next days and weeks are going to be tragic for Ukraine. There's going to be a huge loss of life. But the problem is for Russia is that this is going to get settled on the ground. It doesn't get settled by air power or ballistic missiles, which Russia has in abundance and is going to bomb the heck out of cities. It needs to be settled on the ground. And the Russian armed forces they're getting wrecked on the ground. The Ukrainians are taking losses, but it's a country of 40 plus million people, 45 million people, and a will to resist. And the Russians going into these major cities are going to get chewed up. There's a saying, cities eat armies. And the Russians haven't actually gone into any major cities. The only one that they've taken is a medium-sized city of Kherson in the south, which is where they're having the biggest success. They've not had any success really with Kharkiv yet. That's a precarious situation. And Kiev, they're far from it. Kiev is actually, for the short term, is not under threat. Those columns that were threatening Kiev in the short term are getting beat back. The prime forces, these airborne forces, these special forces that the Russians have thrown at Kiev have been chewed up. The First Guards Tank Army, supposed to be Russia's premier fighting force, has been chewed up. They're running out of ground forces, and they're going to try to replenish, but 70% of Russia's ground force was committed to this campaign already. So there's really not a lot of room for Russia to throw a lot more forces, at least in the short term. They could go ahead and start conscripting and trying to rebuild, but it's going to take some time. And I really think that's, it's going to be tragic, but looking deep, this is where we end up. That's, I looked at the facts on the ground when I thought this was all but certain to happen back in November, December. I didn't think we did enough back then. Now we're still probably not doing, I know we're not doing enough. We need to avoid this turning into a bloodbath that reluctantly drags us into this campaign and provide the Ukrainians what they need to end this quickly.